Devin King was born and raised in a poor neighborhood, where darkness was not just the absence of light, but the darkness of pain, prejudice, and racism. Every day, he lived surrounded by crumbling walls, muddy streets, and the cold, hostile stares of white people he could only see from afar. People like him always faced contempt, their existence perceived as that of inferior beings, outcasts in society. The dilapidated brick houses, the narrow alleys filled with the smell of sweat, and the dimly lit small kitchens were all Devin knew as he grew up. The entire neighborhood seemed to be submerged in the heavy silence of the past, a past where each sigh was a whisper of pain that had endured through generations. Devin's parents, like many others in his community, fought just to survive, never experiencing peace or fulfillment in material life. They lived through uncertain times, working tirelessly while silently enduring the discrimination imposed by those around them. Only white people were allowed to rise to the top of society, while black people like him were suffocated under the weight of racism and the invisible barriers society had set up. Every morning, Devin would hear the footsteps of white people passing by his house, walking hastily, not even glancing toward those like him living in the slums, where most people worked jobs that never brought in enough money to escape poverty. The voices and laughter of white people echoed from other neighborhoods, where they were free to dine comfortably, do light work, and receive respect, while black people faced scorn and invisible prejudice from those who already had everything. Devin had vivid memories of his childhood, of the times he and his classmates were dragged outside by white children who called them inferior or animals. Though he couldn't fully understand why things were this way, Devin deeply felt that he was part of a society where skin color determined everything. He knew that if he didn't find the strength to rise above it, he would be buried forever in the shadow of that contempt. But back then, Devin didn't understand that it was precisely the silence of the past that would nourish the burning desire within him, a powerful desire to fight, to bring change. The pain of racism wasn't just about physical blows or taunts. It was the silence, the indifference of an entire society to the pain of people like Devin. We cannot truly feel that silence until we live in it. Devin had grown up in a world where his voice was never heard, and it was this that made him realize one day he would have to create his own voice. One afternoon, Devin and his friends sat quietly by the moss-covered wall in their neighborhood, watching the shiny cars of white people rush by on the main road. One of Devin's friends, also black, sighed and said, "We will always be outsiders in this society, Devin. No matter how hard we work, it will never be enough to change anything." Those were bitter words, words of despair, of accepting the circumstances. But for Devin, accepting it was not an option. He constantly asked himself, why should he have to endure all of this just because of his skin color and where he was born? Would the silence of the past dictate his life forever? Or would he be the one to break that silence, to create a new voice, a voice of change, a voice of justice? These questions echoed in his mind, preventing him from finding peace. On some nights, when the lights in his house were turned off, Devin sat alone, looking out the window, listening to the silence of the streets, hearing the silence in his soul. He remembered what his mother had said during those long nights. "We must be strong, my son, not to settle for fate, but to change it." That was the only encouragement, the only light Devin had in those dark years. He didn't know when, but he knew that one day he would rise up, shatter that silence, and not let the oppressors and racists continue to live in the prosperity they gained from the oppression of others. During the silent days of the past, Devin learned to face every hardship, to suppress his anger and pain. But inside, the fire of his desire never extinguished. And it was in those silent nights that he promised himself that one day, Devin King would stand up, not only for himself but for all those like him, those who had been oppressed by an unjust system for far too long. Devin King entered the factory like a soldier returning from the battlefield, no longer believing in fairness, but holding on to a faint hope that one day things would change. He was not the first in his family to endure the humiliation of factory work. His father, before passing away, had spent his entire life laboring under the cold gaze of white owners, while his mother had hunched over for years, performing nameless tasks, holding on to the small hope that their children might have a better life. But Devin had little hope. He knew that working in the factory was not an opportunity. It was merely an invisible shackle tightening around the lives of black people like him, with seemingly no end in sight. From his very first steps, Devin sensed the stark difference, the clear separation between him and the white workers at the factory. The luxurious, spacious, well-lit areas were reserved for the white owners and managers, while the place he worked, where black workers like him were confined, was in dark, suffocating workshops where polluted air and the deafening noise of machines were like whispers of slavery in the 21st century. Every day, Devin and his colleagues worked from early morning till late evening, without a moment's rest, their hands calloused from the grueling work. They didn't just labor with tired bodies, their souls became numb, merely watching the long days pile up with no change in sight. Their wages? A number so small it barely kept them alive, certainly not enough to escape poverty. Devin, like his fellow workers, never thought about demanding fairness. They had no right to ask for more because in the eyes of the managers, they were just tools of labor, worthless once they could no longer work. Sometimes, Devin would hear the conversations of other workers, the sighs, the complaints, but all seemed to be mere whispers in the wind. Silence was the only answer, and this silence was the shackle they wore each day. Those days weren't just hours of hard labor. They were a lesson in injustice, in how white people used their power to manipulate and maintain exploitation. Devin realized that the owners weren't just sitting back and reaping the benefits of his and others' misery. They were more sophisticated than that. They set rules, systems to ensure that workers couldn't rise up. They created ties, situations from which Devin and his fellow workers couldn't escape. Every strike, every demand for better working conditions was immediately crushed with violence, threats, and most crucially, the indifference of the police, who always sided with the ones who held the money and power. Their protests were nothing more than meaningless shouts in the night, with no one listening, no one helping. Devin remembered a time when one of the factory workers, a close friend, was brutally beaten for daring to ask for a fairer wage. He was just a black man, small and meek, but still holding on to dreams. Dreams of a day when he could work and live with a bit of dignity. But the price for that dream was wounds, a humiliation that couldn't be washed away. When Devin saw his friend lying on the ground, bloodied and alone, with no one helping, he felt an indescribable rage. He saw how the injustice of this society drained the life from people like him. Every passing day, he didn't just witness physical pain, but also the numbing of his spirit. Exploitation in the factory wasn't just physical. It was also a mental exploitation where white people never acknowledged the contributions of black workers. Devin had witnessed countless times when black laborers worked hard, gave their all, but never received recognition. Their achievements were always overshadowed by praise for white workers. Everything was calculated in a system where black people would never have the chance to stand on equal footing with white people. Every morning when Devin woke up, he asked himself whether he would live forever in this vicious circle, whether he could ever change his fate. He had heard of struggles, uprisings in other places, but in his heart, he knew no one would help him. His community was too weak, and even when they were united, they were still oppressed. The only thing Devin had was his own resilience, a resilience that he knew would never be recognized in this society, but it was the only thing he could rely on. But when he witnessed his friend being beaten, the paralysis within him seemed to ignite. He decided that he couldn't continue living in silence and suffering any longer. Devin understood that no one but him could change this reality. To break free from the shackles of exploitation, he had to fight on his own, and he wouldn't stop until he reclaimed justice for himself and for people like him. The long days in the factory weren't just a burden of labor, but a struggle to reclaim dignity and rights. Devin felt the tension in every passing day, every hour, every minute, like a silent battle that he and the other black workers had to fight, not just with their tired bodies, but with the faith and hope in their souls. Only when this anger and injustice ignited into action could he truly break free from the confines of oppression. The night had fallen, but there was no sleep for Devin. The dim light from the street lamps filtered through the window, unable to drive away the darkness in his mind. In the small, damp room, Devin sat still, his gaze fixed on the outside. The sky was as black as ink, with no stars to light the way, as if the universe itself shared in his sorrow. Yet within him, a fury burned quietly. It flared up fiercely, like an uncontrollable fire that could not be extinguished. His anger did not stem from personal disappointment or the bitterness of past hurts, but from the brutality of the society in which he was forced to live. He recalled the childhood days in the poor neighborhood, where black people like him were never given any respect. Even in the dark alleys, he never felt peace. Every time he stepped outside, Devin knew he was not only fighting hunger and nights without a place to sleep, but also the scorn of wealthy and powerful white people. These people had built a system to maintain their power, while people like him could only live day by day, with no voice, no rights, and nothing but suffering. Devin couldn't take it anymore. He stood up from the old wooden chair and walked outside. The rain began to fall, gently, but enough to wet the empty streets. The sound of the rain was soft, but seemed like a melody inviting change. He looked into the darkness, clearly seeing his own image within it. A black man carrying the weight of an entire generation, a community, those who had never had the chance to truly live, who had never had a voice in a society that always looked down on them. "It's time to act," Devin whispered, his voice low and resolute. He knew that if he didn't take action right now, this injustice would last forever. He couldn't let the next generation live in the shadows of that darkness. Nor could he continue living with the memories of friends who had died, of those who were oppressed to the point of forgetting who they were. Devin walked down the road leading to the factory, the place where the powerful manipulated everything. Each step in the dark felt heavy, yet full of determination. He was not the only one who wanted change. He knew that somewhere in the shadows, there were other workers quietly waiting for an opportunity. They were the ones living the life Devin had once lived. Nothing but hardship and a vague hope that things might one day change. But Devin had realized that this life would never change unless they stood up and fought for their own rights. As he neared the factory, Devin stopped, hiding himself in the darkness. The rain still fell, but in his mind, a storm was beginning to rise. He gripped a metal rod in his hand. It was not just a tool. It was a symbol of change, a weapon to confront those who had exploited the darkest parts of this society to maintain their power. Devin no longer needed to look back. He had prepared thoroughly, studied every corner of the factory, the security systems, the escape routes. He knew that the directors, the ones in charge, were gathered in a meeting room, sipping wine while the workers outside toiled like beasts, working to exhaustion without receiving any recognition. These people were living in a world of injustice. And in their eyes, people like Devin were nothing more than labor tools, worthless when they could no longer work. In the stillness of the dark night, a small but sharp sound echoed. Devin entered the factory area where workers were laboring. The dim lights from the machines in the production area seemed unable to dispel the gloom, the exhaustion on the workers' faces. They didn't see him, didn't recognize the presence of someone who could change their lives. But Devin knew that it wasn't them who needed to see him. It was him who needed to do something so they could see themselves. He moved toward the control room, where the ones controlling the whole system sat. The satisfied faces, the desks piled high with papers and lucrative contracts, the expensive glasses of wine. Everything was a symbol of oppression. When Devin entered, no one noticed his presence until the sound of his footsteps echoed across the cold floor. A powerful blow to the desk startled everyone in the room. "It's time for you to pay the price," Devin said, his voice not loud but filled with authority. Each word struck like a devastating blow to their complacency. The directors in the control room looked at each other, surprised and fearful. They didn't expect anyone to rise against them, but that was the truth. Devin stood there, staring at them without fear. He was no longer a mere worker. He was the leader of a quiet revolution, full of resolve. Tonight, no one could stop his rise, and the revenge would begin with those who had tried to crush all his hopes and those of people like him. The next day, sunlight filtered through the factory windows, casting soft beams of light on the drab, gray walls. In the stifling air, filled with the smell of oil and dust, Devin stood amidst the factory like a stranger, sensing the tension in the air. Though he couldn't see it, he knew that change had begun to stir from within these very walls. Life could no longer continue as it had before. His rage was not a temporary outburst, but a smoldering fire, one that would never be extinguished until everything changed. Devin looked around. The black workers, most of whom had dedicated their lives to this factory, continued working like puppets with their strings pulled. The loud noise of the machines echoed like whispers in their minds, their tired arms repeating the same motions, their weary footsteps dragging them forward. But something inside them had changed. Devin could sense it in their eyes. Perhaps they didn't yet realize what was unfolding, but they too knew that the injustice couldn't last forever. They just hadn't dared to think about rising up in rebellion. Devin couldn't stop now. He stepped out of the production area, where every eye turned to him. No one spoke, but their eyes were filled with countless questions. Devin stood tall, his gaze resolute, and then he turned back to face them. One of the workers, someone Devin had known for a long time, approached him, fear still on his face, but with a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Devin, what are you planning to do?" the worker asked, his voice laced with worry. "We won't wait any longer," Devin replied, his voice deep and steady. "It's time to act. Everything has to change, not just for us, but for those who come after." Without saying another word, Devin turned and walked into the small room in the factory where secret meetings of the workers were held. The room, once a place for organizing strikes and discussing their rights, had now become the birthplace of a great rebellion. Devin didn't just want to change his own life. He wanted to change an entire generation. He wanted them to know that they were not slaves. They were human beings who deserved respect. Day by day, Devin's group grew. The workers, those who had never had a voice before, began to find their way to him. A tall man, with rough hands from years of construction work, stood up to speak. "If we don't stand up now, when will we ever have the chance to change? We've lost everything. All that's left is our dignity and our rights." Others nodded in agreement. They began organizing meetings, assigning tasks, and making plans for action. Devin started to instill in them the belief and vision of a future they could shape themselves. He reminded them of the years they had suffered, of the pain they had endured, and of the losses they could never forget. But it was in those losses that they had seen the light. And that light was no longer distant. This rebellion wasn't just about demanding fairness in their work. Devin wanted something greater, a fundamental change in this society, where people like him were no longer seen as labor tools, but as human beings with the right to freedom and dignity. Devin wasn't just striking out against those who oppressed him, but against the very system they had built, a system where every individual, whether rich or poor, was crushed under the weight of injustice. Devin's group began doing things they had only dared to think about before. Strikes began to occur more frequently, and the walls of silence started to crumble. Workers stopped working, stood up, and protested. They shattered the factory windows, exposing the brutal exploitation of the powerful. Their cries echoed throughout the industrial area, resonating through the streets like warnings to the wealthy, powerful people sitting in their lavish rooms, listening to the sound of money pouring into their hands. But the rebellion wasn't easy. Those in power reacted swiftly. The military, police, and the factory owners' lackeys were mobilized to suppress the movement. Workers were arrested, beaten, and those who participated in the protests were threatened. Yet every time this happened, the strength of the movement grew. Devin knew that this struggle would not be easy, but he couldn't stop now. He had a responsibility to himself and to those who had placed their trust in him. One night, as everyone was preparing for an assault on the factory's control center, Devin stood alone outside, gazing at the lights in the dark. He knew this fight wouldn't end in one night, but every small step they took was already beginning to change everything. They were rewriting their own story, a story no longer full of humiliation, but one of strength and freedom. The rebellion had begun, and now it could not be stopped. These workers, with Devin leading them, had risen up, not just for themselves, but for all those who had suffered in silence. They would no longer be the oppressed, no longer ghosts in an unjust society. And in the dark night, their fury had turned into a fire, an unquenchable fire. Devin stood by the window of the small room, the city lights reflecting off the glass, casting an eerie sense of solitude over him. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the anxiety that had taken over him. The battle had begun, and although hope had sparked within him, the dangers were no less real. He knew that the group's first move would not just be a test of their resolve, but a defining step, a step they could not take back. That afternoon, Devin's group had planned an attack on the factory. They weren't seasoned warriors, nor did they have advanced weapons, but they had the strength of their determination and the pain they had endured for so long. Devin stood at the front, holding an old megaphone, raising his hand, and locking eyes with those who waited for him. Their eyes were filled with both anger and hope. They trusted him, and Devin could not let them down. The attack was not loud like the bloody battles one might see in movies. It was a quiet march, but each step carried with it hatred and belief in a better future. They moved carefully, step by step. Some carried old guns, others sturdy wooden planks, ready to protect themselves and those around them. Devin led, quietly walking through the streets, making sure not to make a sound. He knew that no matter how careful they were, a single mistake could ruin everything. As they neared the factory, Devin signaled for the group to stop. Everyone gathered around him, their eyes bright with determination, a hint of nervousness but also resolve. Devin took a deep breath and said, his voice firm, "This is the moment we act. Remember, our goal is to make sure no one dies. Strike at the heart of this system, but do not harm the innocent." Everyone nodded, and Devin knew they understood. This attack would not just be an act of punishment against their oppressors, but a message, one that everyone had to hear. In eerie silence, Devin's group began to move into the factory area. The large iron gates creaked open, as if they were the gates of a prison welcoming people trying to break free from their chains. Devin waved for everyone to follow him as they stepped past barbed wire and into the factory grounds. He could hear the sounds of the machines, high-pitched whines and rumblings that felt like the mouth of a giant swallowing the hopes of the workers. They were all pawns in a game being played by those in power. Devin couldn't let this continue. As the group ventured deeper into the factory, they began sabotaging equipment, rendering the crucial machines in the production area useless. They threw aside old planks, trampled on electrical sockets, and splashed paint on control panels to stop them from functioning. A few of them quickly seized the surveillance area, tying up the guards to prevent them from calling for help. At that moment, Devin heard footsteps. The door ahead of him opened, and a group of white guards appeared, guns in hand. One of them yelled, "Stop! You have no right to do this. You will pay for this." The threats did not faze Devin. He locked eyes with the head guard and spoke coldly. "What have you done to us all these years? Don't think you can keep living peacefully anymore." At this, one of the guards stepped back, his hand trembling as he looked at the broken machinery around him. Devin knew that they had caused enough disruption to harm the system, but this was just the beginning. The rebellion needed to achieve a tangible result. They couldn't stop here. The oppressors had begun to respond. As the alarm went off, a full squad of police was called in, heavily armed. Devin felt no fear. He turned to look at the people around him. "If we don't fight today, we'll forever be slaves. Even if we have to sacrifice, we must stand up." The police quickly surrounded the area, their guns trained on Devin's group. "Don't do anything reckless," a police officer shouted. "You will pay for this." But Devin remained unmoved. He had heard these threats before. Every time he did, it reminded him of the long days he had endured in the factory, the brutal beatings, and the degradation. Today he would not step back. Suddenly, a loud explosion echoed through the air. One of the trucks carrying supplies in the factory area erupted into flames. A confrontation broke out, and in the chaos, Devin's group quickly scattered, confusing the police. They had grown accustomed to these confrontations. The workers were no longer meek sheep. They had become hungry lions, ready to fight for their rights. The attack, although meticulously planned, could not avoid threats and retribution. However, Devin realized that threats and fear could not stop someone who had made up their mind to fight for justice. Every threat, every gunshot, every warning only fueled the fire in his heart. They weren't just fighting the ones in power, but the system that had oppressed them for so long. The war had only just begun, and Devin knew that the challenges ahead would be even harsher. But in his eyes, the resilience of the workers spoke volumes. They would not back down. They would not be defeated. The threats were just strong winds blowing by, but the fire within them would burn forever. Devin stood before the large factory like a warrior preparing for battle, the morning light slowly shining over the tops of the towering buildings, reflecting off the glossy glass windows. But to him, this was not just another day. This was the day of transformation, the day he decided to tear apart everything that the system of racial discrimination and exploitation had built. Today would mark the end of an old world full of injustice. With the help of his companions, Devin had devised a carefully planned attack. But that plan was just a small part of the larger battle he had to face. His heart beat fast, but his mind remained cold. They were too close to their goal now. There was no turning back. This factory was not just a place of labor for them. It was the symbol of oppression, the heart of a corrupt system that Devin could not leave unchallenged. The morning silence was broken as they entered the construction area, the sudden light falling on the old, rusty machines. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the vast space. The group split into smaller teams, each with a clear task. Devin led, directing them through broken windows and abandoned doors left ajar in the night. Every step they took was significant, a confirmation that the workers were no longer afraid. They were no longer shadows in the dark. They were standing tall, facing the injustice directly. As they neared the main section of the factory, Devin signaled for the group to stop. He pulled out an old map, its lines never clearer than they were today. Now, we'll approach the main area from 3 directions. I'll lead, and you follow, he said firmly, emphasizing each word. His companions exchanged glances and nodded. Everything was ready. The group silently moved towards their target. When they reached the front door, the sound of their knocking rang out like a declaration of war. Devin motioned for one team to stay back, preparing to break the door down. Meanwhile, another team began sabotaging the factory's electrical systems, cutting off the security systems, rendering the surveillance cameras useless. Meanwhile, Devin and a few others advanced to the surveillance area, where the guards of the power system always stood watch, ready to face any threat. Not long after, a loud noise echoed. The main door of the factory was kicked in, and Devin's group stormed in, shattering the peace of a dictatorship, an empire built on the suffering of innocent people. Immediately, the white guards stationed there attempted to resist. A confrontation erupted right in front of Devin. The guards drew their guns, but Devin's group was more prepared. They had only makeshift weapons and wooden sticks, but they possessed something the factory's leaders did not: belief in justice and the power of unity. Devin saw the guards stagger in panic. One raised his gun, but Devin quickly lunged at him, knocking the gun out of his hands. His group swiftly subdued the guards. No one was injured, but they managed to keep them silent. The sounds of gunfire and clashing weapons filled the air, but Devin's group remained determined. They could not back down. The attack quickly escalated into a larger confrontation. Devin ordered one team to advance toward the control center, where the factory's leaders were hiding. It was the heart of manipulation, where decisions about the lives of the workers were made, where everything was orchestrated under the influence of a bloody system. Devin could not allow it to continue. As they approached the control area, a senior white manager stood before the door, holding a long metal rod. He looked at Devin's group with contempt, as if he were a god above, and they were mere lowly creatures not worthy of his gaze. But Devin paid no mind to his disdainful stare. He stepped forward, his voice cold as ice. "It's time for you to pay for what you've done." The manager scoffed, but Devin didn't give him a chance to speak any further. He swung his arm, delivering a powerful blow that sent the manager crashing to the ground. Devin gestured for his group to continue inside. As they opened the door, the sight inside made everyone shudder. Tables piled high with papers, contracts signed in the blood of workers, the glowing computer screens, the fraudulent reports. Everything was a testament to an empire built on undeniable injustice. In that room, Devin came face to face with the leaders of the system. They sat there, faces blank, but the panic was hidden deep in their eyes. Devin walked in, his eyes blazing. "You can't keep controlling everything anymore," he said, his voice as hard as steel. "You can't deceive the world any longer." The confrontation between Devin and the factory leaders was tense. Every word from Devin was like a fatal blow. Each sentence carried the justice he had carried in his heart for so many years. The leaders stared at him, unable to speak, but they knew it was over. They had lost everything. This attack was not just a victory for Devin and the rebels. It was a triumph of justice, of the oppressed workers. The factory's leaders were forced to kneel, realizing that everything they had built on the blood and tears of others had collapsed. Finally, Devin stood on the podium, looking down at the workers who now gazed at him with eyes filled with hope. They had fought, and they had won. The attack had broken the shackles of the regime, and from today, they would no longer be puppets in the hands of the powerful. The system that had oppressed so many for so long had officially crumbled, and the world of injustice no longer existed. But Devin knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. There was still much to be done, many more people to save. But now, with the light of justice shining, he could confidently look ahead. The fall of this regime was a reminder that nothing lasts forever, especially when the oppressors have become too arrogant. Devin stood in the dimly lit meeting room, the air heavy with the musty scent of old papers and unnamed files. A long table dominated the space, cluttered with reports, contracts hidden in the shadows, and evidence that he had desperately searched for over a long period. He sighed, looking at the pile of documents he had gathered. These were not just lifeless numbers. They were clear proof of the crimes committed by this system. A victory not just for the resistance, but for every piece of evidence that had exposed the truth. Devin's heart raced. The confrontation was approaching. This battle would not only take place in the shadows of the factory, but also in the light of justice. He looked down at his hands, feeling the pulse of resilience. Everything had changed. The days of living in oppression, injustice, and humiliation were now behind him. Yet, what troubled him more than anything was this moment. The moment when everything would have to be faced and ended once and for all. While Devin's group searched through the documents, looking for evidence to prove the crimes of the authorities, Devin sat in a corner, tightly gripping an old pen, staring at the maps and plans. He began reassessing everything, preparing for the final confrontation. In that moment, he remembered the workers who had lost their lives in suffering. They had been unable to resist. They had endured silence as if it were a given. But now no one could stop this fight. No one could halt the rise of justice. In another meeting room, where the factory's leaders were gathered, the air was thick with tension. They were reviewing every move Devin and his team had made. They knew their time was up. Devin had regained control, but the ones in power still weren't ready to give up. Each of them felt uneasy, knowing there was no preparation that could save their current situation. Devin stood up, brushing back his black coat, the light streaming through the window highlighting his face. In his eyes was determination, but also coldness. He knew this confrontation would not be as easy as the others. This was a no-compromise battle, and there was no room for error. He stepped forward, leading his group to where the powerful were hiding. The confrontation began without fanfare, but the tension in the air was so thick it could be cut into pieces. Devin and his team stormed into the room where the leaders were meeting, Devin's hand firmly holding the evidence he had prepared. Every eye in the room was on him, each face filled with suspicion and fear. They stared at Devin, not only because he was the leader of the rebellion, but also because of the evidence he held in his hand. Devin walked to the large table, placing the evidence down, and the room fell silent. "I have enough evidence to make you confess," Devin said, his voice unwavering. "Every contract, every report, every number in these documents proves that you've used exploitation to get rich. You've taken the pain and sweat of the workers to build this empire. You've robbed the lives of those who served you." The leaders sat still, a terrifying silence enveloping the room. Devin didn't need to say more. The documents spoke for themselves. One of them, a cold-looking man, the head of the factory, wiped his forehead, sitting up straight, as if unable to believe what he was hearing. A few others bit their lips, their eyes filled with regret, but also fear. Did you think what happened would forever be buried under the silence of power? Devin continued, his voice as cold as a knife. "You've boycotted everything that belongs to us, but you can't boycott the truth. Everything you've done has been recorded. Every dirty action you've taken has been proven. At this moment, the tension became unbearable. One of the leaders stood up, swinging his hand toward Devon. Your workers are just tools, just puppets, he shouted, his voice full of defiance. You can't change anything. This system has been set up and will never change. Devon stood firm, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Oh, have you forgotten that nothing lasts forever? Everything you've built through violence, threats, and fear will only turn to rubble. You may take everything from us, but you cannot take away justice. The confrontation between them continued, tense and unresolved. The factory's leaders tried to resist, but every word from Devon only made them more panicked. His words were not just questions, but accusations, undeniable charges. Finally, one of the leaders, who had always considered himself untouchable, lowered his head in admission of guilt. He knew he could not fight against the evidence, nor could he continue to live under the shadow of the power he had created. At that moment, Devon pressed further, urging his allies not to stop there. The factory's leaders had to face the law. He had prepared everything necessary. The evidence, the reports, the testimonies from the workers who had been oppressed, everything had been handed over to the authorities. This was not just Devon's victory. It was a victory for all those who had suffered in silence. Finally, as the confrontation ended, Devon looked back at what had been accomplished. He had done it. The exploitative system had paid the price. The powerful had been brought to justice. And most importantly, Devon no longer felt the weight of pain in his heart. He had freed himself and his comrades from the invisible shackles of society. This was not the end, but the beginning of a new life, a life in which justice would not only be enforced but protected. That day, Devon stood in the small courtroom, where each wall seemed to hold the weight of forgotten stories, lost lives, and unheard pains. The cold light of the courtroom shone on the faces, reflecting exhaustion, yet filled with hope. At last, everything had come to a head. The struggles, the pains, the sacrifices of so many had now converged into a moment when justice would be delivered. But Devon knew that justice wasn't just about seeing those who caused harm being sentenced. Justice was a long process, one that didn't stop at sending the criminals to prison. Justice was when everything that had been taken away would be returned, not just to him, but to all those who had stood up, who had dared to resist and fight for fairness. But right now, in front of him, those who had oppressed him and his community were facing the consequences. The trial lasted throughout the day, and when the final gavel was struck, a strong verdict rang out. Justice has been served. The defendant will receive a life sentence for the proven crimes, including corruption, fraud, and acts of violence against the workers. Devon didn't feel joy. He didn't gloat over the fact that those who had caused so much suffering were now paying the price. Instead, he felt a sense of peace, relief, but also a deep reflection on what he had yet to accomplish. Because for Devon, sending the powerful to prison wasn't enough. What he wanted wasn't just revenge. It was a complete overhaul of the system that had suffocated him and thousands like him. He had fought for years not only against the oppressors, but to build a better future for his community. A future without discrimination, without the invisible walls that divided the people. The next day, when things had calmed down, Devon stepped out of the courthouse. He saw the sunlight pouring over the streets, but it seemed that this light no longer shone just for him. It was the light for all those who had been oppressed in the dark. It was the light of freedom, the light of hope. He knew that what he had done would open a new path for those who had been exploited. But that path would not be easy. He would have to continue fighting, continue reclaiming what had been taken. Although the victory was clear, Devon knew that his journey wasn't over. Every step he took was aimed at a future where injustice would have no place. He looked around, and the neighborhoods were changing. The people in the slums were slowly rising, beginning to raise their voices. Devin started planning his next moves. He decided that he would not stop here. He needed to build a strong legal system to protect workers and those who faced racial discrimination. In the following months, Devin worked tirelessly to change unjust laws, calling on community organizations and other leaders to join the struggle. He didn't just want to overthrow a system, but to replace it with one that was fairer and more humane. He met with political leaders, experts, and those who could help him build a fair legal system that would protect the rights of everyone, no matter who they were, where they came from, or their skin color. With each meeting, with every discussion, Devin felt that he wasn't alone. He found allies from every corner of society, people ready to stand up and fight alongside him. These discussions were no longer simple debates about rights. They were a struggle for human dignity. Devin and his allies made important decisions that paved the way for the Black community and all those who faced racial discrimination. One early morning, Devin sat with his fellow fighters. Their faces, once dirted by the struggle, now shone with resilience, no longer marked by fear. Devin began sharing the path he wanted to take, the society he wanted to build. A society without discrimination, without injustice. A society where justice wasn't just something to dream of, but something everyone had the right to receive. And soon, Devin's efforts began to bear fruit. Laws were changed, protests were organized, and with each action, Devin saw himself stepping into a new path. A path not just for him, but for all those who had, who were, and who would continue to fight. Justice was no longer an elusive concept. It had become reality. Finally, Devin stood before thousands at a grand ceremony, where he was honored as a hero. But he didn't feel smug. He merely smiled and gazed into the distance. Because in his heart, justice wasn't the end goal. It was a journey that would never end. He had achieved what he wanted, but there were still many battles ahead. And he was ready to keep fighting to build a world where justice could not be taken away from anyone. The story of Devin King is not just a personal struggle, but a journey of rising from the darkness of oppressed lives. A man who grew up in a poor neighborhood, surrounded by the dark walls of racism, couldn't help but ask, can sacrifice and perseverance change a system that has existed for centuries? And Devin proved, not just by himself, but with those standing by his side, they could change a world that seemed immovable. Throughout the journey, one thing became crystal clear to Devin. Resilience is the foundation of all struggles. The hardships of life in the slums couldn't break him. Each time he was pushed back, he stood up even stronger. Every time the mocking laughter of the wealthy echoed, Devin became more determined not to be buried in the contempt society had placed upon him. He learned that no matter how dark life may push him, with enough perseverance, he would find light in the most unexpected places. Then came the moment when Devin realized that to win, we must face our fears. The memories of past injustices were like ghosts, constantly haunting him. But instead of running away, Devin faced them, turning those fears into motivation. He knew that only by confronting the suffering could he take control of his life. And every step he took, though exhausting and painful, was a step closer to victory. But Devin didn't fight alone. He understood that the strength of unity was the most powerful weapon. He wasn't just a leader. He was also a teammate, a friend to those who shared his ideals. When all the workers in the factory stood up alongside him, they were no longer nameless pawns in the hands of the wealthy. They were people with the right to change, with the right to speak. It was that unity that created extraordinary strength, the fire that burned down the walls of separation, and no one could extinguish it. Yet, Devin also realized that justice isn't a simple battle. Every step he took wasn't always a victory. Sometimes it was a painful setback. But he never gave up. He knew that justice wasn't a destination, but a journey, a struggle that never ends. Every step he took, every decision he made, were seeds of change, even if they didn't blossom immediately. In those long, dark nights, Devin didn't just fight against the oppressors. He also had to fight against himself, against the limitations society had placed on him. He learned that in order to change, sometimes we must pay the price. And that price was the sacrifice of his comrades, the loss of nameless lives he couldn't save. But Devin never turned back. He understood that great change cannot happen without sacrifices. Those who fought by his side were the ones who could be greater than the powerful figures, because they stepped on pain to reach the light. But in every battle, whether for personal gain or for fairness, hope is always the key to keep fighting. Devin taught us that when everything seems to be falling apart, when light seems like a distant hope, it is hope that will light the fire to make us rise. Hope is not futile dreaming. It's an unwavering determination, the persistence that we must never give up. Devin's story is not just about an individual triumph. It is a lesson about the strength of humanity, about resilience, unity, and sacrifice. And as Devin has proven, only when we fight for justice do we truly gain freedom and dignity for ourselves, for the community, and for all those who have been silenced and buried.